Section 16 of Short Story Classics, American, Volume 2, by Various. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by John Patterson. Short Story Classics, American, Volume 2, by Various. Jean don Timoine by Thomas Allibone Janvier. Part 2. The next day, all the morning papers contained elaborate interviews with the Marquis. For each of the several reporters who had been put on the case, believing that he alone had failed to get the facts, and being upheld by a lofty determination that no other reporter should get a beat on him, had evolved from his own inner consciousness the story that Jean, for the best of reasons, had refused to tell. The stories thus told, being based upon the original fiction, bore a family resemblance to each other, and as all of them were interesting, they stimulated popular curiosity in regard to their hero to a very high pitch. As the result of them, Jean found himself the most conspicuous man in New York. During the 3 hours of his walk, he was the center of an interested crowd. Several benevolent persons stopped to tell him of fatherless young women with whom they were acquainted, and to urge upon him the probability that each of these young women was his long-lost child. The representatives of a dozen detective bureaus introduced themselves to him and made offer of their professional services. A messenger from the chief of police handed him a polite note tendering the services of the department and inviting him to a conference. It was maddening. But worst of all were his meetings with Rose. As these multiplied, the conviction became irresistible that they were not the result of chance. Indeed, her manner made doubt upon this head impossible. At first she gave him only a passing glance, then a glance somewhat longer, then a look of kindly interest, then a long look of sympathy, and at last she bestowed upon him a gentle, almost affectionate smile that expressed, as plainly as a smile could express, her sorrow for his misery and her readiness to comfort him. In a word, Rose Carthame's conduct simply was outrageous. The jealous anger which had inflamed Jean's breast the night before swelled and expanded into a raging passion. He longed to engage in mortal combat this stranger who was alienating the affection that should be his. The element of absurdity in the situation no longer was apparent to him. In truth, as he reasoned, the situation was not absurd. To all intents and purposes, he was two people, and it was the other one of him, not himself at all, who was winning Rose's interest, perhaps her love. For a moment, the thought crossed his mind that he would adjust the difficulty in his own favor by remaining this other person always. But the hard truth confronted him that every time he washed his face, he would cease to be the elderly Marquis, with the harder truth that the fabulous wealth with which, as the Marquis, the newspapers had endowed him, was too entirely fabulous to serve as a basis for substantial life. And being thus cut off from hope, he fell back upon jealous hatred of himself. That night, the evening paper in which the first mention of the mysterious French nobleman had been made contained an article cleverly contrived to give point to the mystery in its commercial aspect. The fact had been observed. The article declared that the nobleman's promenade began and ended at a prominent clothing establishment on Broadway, and then followed, in the guise of a contribution toward the clearing up of the mystery, an interview with the proprietor of the establishment in question. However, the interview left the mystery just where it found it, for all that the tailor told was that the Marquis had bought several suits of clothes from him, that he had shown himself to be an exceptionally critical person in the matter of his wearing apparel, that he had expressed repeatedly his entire satisfaction with his purchases. In another portion of the paper was a glaring advertisement in which the clothing man set forth in an animated fashion the cheapness and desirability of the Marquis suit, a suit that might be seen to advantage on the person of the afflicted French nobleman now in our midst, who had honored it with his approval, and in whose honor it had been named. Upon reading the newspaper narrative and its advertisement pendant, Jaune groaned aloud. He was oppressed by a horror of discovery, and here, as it seemed to him in his morbidly nervous condition, was a clue to his duplex identity sufficiently obvious to be apparent even to a detective. The Count Cbteddy Courtrai, as has been intimated, went so far as to fidget while listening to Mademoiselle Carthame's vivacious description of her encounter with the handsome Marquis. Being regaled during the ensuing evening with a very similar narrative, a materially modified version of the events which had aroused in so lively a manner the passion of jealousy in the breast of Jean d'Antemoine, the Count ceased merely to fidget and became the prey to a serious anxiety. He determined that the next day, quite unobtrusively, he would observe Mademoiselle Carthame in her relations with this unknown but dangerously fascinating nobleman, and also that he would give some attention to the nobleman himself. This secondary purpose was strengthened the next morning, while the Count was engaged with his coffee and newspaper, by his finding in the Courrier des États-Unis a translation of the paragraph stating the curious fact that the daily walk of the Marquis began and ended at the Broadway tailor shop. Having finished his breakfast, the Count leisurely betook himself to Broadway. As he slowly strolled eastward, he observed on the other side of the street Jean d'Antemoine, in his desperately shabby raiment, hurriedly walking eastward also. The Count murmured a brief panegyric upon Monsieur d'Antemoine, in which the words "cet animal" alone were distinguishable. They were near Broadway at this moment, and to the Count's surprise, Monsieur d'Antemoine entered the clothing establishment from which the Marquis departed upon his daily walk. Could it be possible, he thought, that fortune had smiled upon the young artist, and that he was about to purchase a new suit of clothes? The Count entertained the charitable hope that such could not be the case. It was the Count's purpose, in order that he might follow also the movements of Mademoiselle Carthame, to follow the Marquis from the beginning to the end of his promenade. He set himself, therefore, to watching closely for the appearance of the grief-stricken foreigner, moving carelessly the while from one shop window to another that commanded a view of the field. At the end of half an hour, when the Count was beginning to think that the object of his solicitude was a myth, out from the broad portal of the clothing establishment came the Marquis in all his glory, more glorious in truth than Solomon, and more melancholy than the melancholy Jacques. And yet, for an instant, the Count Cbteddy Courtrai was possessed by the absurd fancy that this stately personage was Jean d'Antemoine. Truly, here was the same tall, handsome figure, the same easy, elegant carriage, the same cut of hair and beard. But the resemblance went no further, for beard and hair were gray almost to whiteness, the face was pale and old, and the clothes, so far from being desperately seedy, were more resplendent even than the Count's own. No, the thought was incredible, preposterous, and yet the Count could not discharge it from his mind. He stamped his foot savagely. This mystery was becoming more interesting than pleasing. In the crowd that the Marquis drew in his wake, as he slowly, sadly sauntered up Broadway, the Count had no difficulty in following him unobserved. The situation was that of the previous day, only it was intensified, and therefore, to his hero, the more horrible. The benevolent people with stray, fatherless young women to dispose of were out in greater force. The detectives were more aggressive. The newspaper people were more persistent. the general public was more keenly interested in the whole performance. And Rose, most dreadful of all, was more outrageous than ever. The Count grew almost green with rage during the 3 hours that he was a witness of this young woman's scandalous conduct. A dozen times she met the Marquis in the course of his walk, and each time that she met him, she greeted him with yet more tender smile. A curious fact that at first surprised, then puzzled, then comforted the Count was the very obvious annoyance which these flattering attentions caused their recipient. Evidently, he persistently endeavored to evade the meetings which Rose as persistently and more successfully endeavored to force upon him. Within the scope of Monsieur de Courtrais' comprehension, only one reason seemed to be sufficient to explain the determination on the part of the Marquis to resist the advances of a singularly attractive young woman, whose good disposition toward him was so conspicuously, though so irregularly, manifested, a fear of recognition. And this reason adjusted itself in a striking manner to the queer notion that had come into his mind that the Marquis was an ideal creation, whose reality was Jean d'Antemoine. The thought was absurd, irrational, but it grew stronger and stronger within him, and became an assured conviction when, shortly after the promenade of the Marquis had ended, Jean came forth from the clothing store in his normal condition of shabbiness and youth. The Count was not in all respects a praiseworthy person, but among his vices was not that of stupidity. Without any very tremendous mental effort, he grasped the fact that his rival had sold himself into bondage as a walking advertisement, and knowing this, a righteous exultation filled his soul. Jean's destiny, so far as Mademoiselle Carthaim was concerned, he felt was in his power, and he was perplexed by no nice doubts as to the purpose to which the power that he had gained should be applied. Untroubled by the knowledge that his secret was discovered, Jean entered upon the last day of his martyrdom. It was the most agonizing day of all. The benevolent persons, the reporters, the detectives, the crowd surging about him, drove him almost to madness. He walked as one dazed, and above and over all he was possessed by a frenzy of jealousy that came of the offensively friendly smiles which Rose bestowed upon him as she forced meetings upon him again and again. It was with difficulty that he restrained himself from laying violent hands upon this bogus Marquis, who falsely and infamously had beguiled away from him the love for which he gladly would have given his life. Only the blood of his despicable rival, he felt, would satisfy him. He longed to find himself with a sword in his hand, on a bit of smooth turf, and the villainous Marquis over against him, ready to be run through. The thought was so delightful, so animating, that involuntarily he made a lunge, and had to apologize confusedly to an elderly gentleman whom he had poked in the back with his umbrella. At last, the 3 hours of torture, the last of his 2 weeks of hateful servitude, came to an end. Pale beneath his false paleness, haggard beyond his false haggardness of age, he entered the clothing store and once more was himself. With a gladness unspeakable, he washed off his wrinkles and washed out the gray from his hair and beard, with a sense of infinite satisfaction that, a fortnight earlier, he would not have believed possible. He resumed his shabby old clothes. Had he chosen to do so, he might have walked away in the new and magnificent apparel which he now fairly had earned. But just at present his loathing for these fine garments was beyond all words. The tailor fain would have had the masquerade continue longer, for as he frankly stated, the Marquis suit was having a tremendous sale. But Jean was deaf not only to the tailor's blandishments, but to his offers of substantial cash. "Not for the millions would I be in this part of the Marquis for one day yet more," he said firmly, and he added, "I trust to you in honor, sir, that not never shall my name be spoken in this affair." "Couldn't speak it if I wanted to, my dear boy. It's a mystery to me how you're able to say it yourself. Well, I'd like you to run the Marquis for another week, but if you won't, I suppose, so there's an end of it. I'm sorry you haven't enjoyed it. I have. It's been as good a thing as I ever got a hold of. Now give me your address, and I'll have your clothes sent to you. Don't you want some more? I don't mind letting you have a regular outfit if you want it. One good turn, and you've done me a good turn, and that's a fact. But Jean declined this liberal offer, and declined also to leave his address, which would have involved a revelation of his name. It was a comfort to him to know that his name was safe, a great comfort. So the garments of the forever departed Marquis were put up in a big bundle, and Jean journeyed homeward to his studio in Greenwich, bearing his sheaves with him in a Bleecker Street car. "Well, you are a cheeky beggar, Dantemouin," said Van Dyke Brown cheerfully the next morning, as he came into Jean's studio with a newspaper in his hand. "So you are the Marquis who has been setting the town wild for the last week, eh? And whom did you bet with? And what started you in such a crazy performance anyway? Tell me all about it. It's as funny—" "Good heavens, Dantemouin, what's the matter? Are you ill?" For Jean had grown deathly pale and was gasping. "I do not know of what it is that you talk," he answered, with a great effort. "Oh, come now, that's too thin, Why, here's a whole column about it, telling how you made a bet with somebody that you could set all the town to talking about you, and yet do it all in such a clever disguise that nobody would know who you really were, not even your most intimate friends. And I should say that you had won handsomely. Why, I've seen you on Broadway 12 times myself this last week, and I never had the remotest suspicion that the Marquis was you. I must say, though," continued Brown reflectively, and looking closely at Jean, "that it was stupid of me. I did think that you had a familiar sort of look, and once, I remember, it did occur to me that you looked astonishing like yourself. It was the clothes, you see, that threw me out. Wherever did you get such a stunning rig? I don't believe that I'd have known you dressed like that, even if you hadn't been gray and wrinkled. But tell me all about it, old man. It must have been jolly fun." "Fun," groaned Jean. "It was despair." And then, his heart being very full and his longing for sympathy overpowering, Jean told Brown the whole story. "But what is this of one bet, my dear Van?" he concluded. "I do not of the least know." "Well, here it all is in the paper anyway. Calls you a distinguished animal painter, and alludes to your strikingly vigorous lioness and cubs and powerful dray horses at the last spring exhibition of the Society of American Artists. Must be somebody who knows you, you see, and somebody who means well by you, too. There's nothing at all about your being an advertisement. Indeed, there's nothing in the story but a good joke, of which you are the hero. It's an eccentric sort of heroism, to be sure, but then for some unknown reason people never seem to believe that artists are rational human beings, so your eccentricity will do you no harm. And it's no end of an advertisement for you. Whoever wrote it meant well by you. And by Jove, I know who it is. It's little Conte Crayon. He's a good-hearted little beggar, and he likes you ever so much, for I've heard him say so. But how he ever got hold of the story, and especially such a jolly version of it, I don't see." At this moment, by a pleasing coincidence, Conte Crayon himself appeared with the desired explanation. "You see," he said, "that beast of a cicatif de Courtrai hunted me up yesterday and told me the yarn about you and the slop-shop man. He wanted me to write it up and publish it as a joke, he said, but it was clear enough that he was in ugly earnest about it. So you see, I had to rush it into print in the way I chose to tell it, which won't do you a bit of harm, Dantemouin, in order to head him off. The blackguard meant to get you into a mess, and if I'd hung fire, he'd have told somebody else about it, and had the real story published. Of course, there's nothing in the real story that you need to be ashamed of, but if it had been told, you certainly would have been laughed at, and nasty people would have said nasty things about it. And as there wasn't any time to lose, I had to print it first, and then come here and explain matters afterward. And what I've got to say is this. Just you cheek it out and say that it was a bet, and that you won it. Brown and I will back you up in it, and so will the slop-shop man. I've been to see him this morning, and he is so pleased with the way that the Marquis suit is selling, and with the extra free advertisement that he got out of my article, that he's promised to adopt the bet version in his advertisement in all the papers. He is going to advertise that the Marquis suit is so called because everybody who wears it looks like a Marquis, just as you did. This cuts the ground right from under the Count's feet, you see, for nobody believed him on his oath if they could help it. And now I must clear out. I've got a race at Jerome Park at 2 o'clock. It's all right, D'Antemone. I assure you it's all right, but I should advise you to punch the Count's head all the same. Van Dyke Brown thought it was all right, too, as he talked the matter over with Jaune after little Comte Crayon had gone. But Jaune refused to be comforted. So far as the public was concerned, he admitted that Comte Crayon's story had saved him, but he was oppressed by a great dread of what might be the effect of the truth upon Rose. For Jean d'Antemone was too honest a gentleman even to think of deceiving his mistress. He must tell her the whole story, without reserve, and as she approved or disapproved of what he had done must his hopes of happiness live or die. "Better have it out with her today, and be done with it," counselled Brown. "Ah, it is well for you to speak of a hurry, my good Van, but it is not you who go to execute your life. No, I have not the force to go today. Today I go to make a long walk. Then this night I sleep well. Tomorrow in the morning do I go to affront my destiny." And from this resolution Jean was not to be moved. Yet it was an unfortunate resolution, for it gave the Count Siccatif de Courtrai time and opportunity for a flank movement, and the Count's breast rage and astonishment contended for the mastery as he contemplated the curious miscarriage of his newspaper assault. He had chosen this line of attack partly because his modesty counseled him to keep his own personality in the background, partly because the wider the publicity of his rival's disgrace, the more complete would that disgrace be. But as his newspaper ally failed him, he took the campaign into his own hands. That is to say, he hurried to tell the true story, and a good deal more than the true story, to Rose and Madame Carthaim. Concerning its effect upon Rose, he was in doubt, but its effect upon Madame Carthaim was all that he could desire. This severe person instantly took the cue that the Count dexterously gave her by affecting the palliate Jean's erratic conduct. He urged that, insomuch as Monsieur d'Antemone was a conspicuous failure as an artist, for him to engage himself to a tailor as a walking advertisement, so far from being a disgrace to him, was greatly to his credit. And Madame Carthaim promptly and vehemently asserted that it wasn't. She refused to regard what he had done in any other light than that of a crime. She declared that never again should his offensive form darken her door. Solemnly, she forbade Rose from recognizing him when in the future they should chance to meet. And then she abated her severity to the extent of thanking the Count with tears in her eyes for the service that he had done her in tearing off this viper's disguise. Naturally, the Count was charmed by Madame Carthaim's energetic indignation. He perceived that his unselfish investigations of the actions of Monsieur Jean were bearing excellent fruit. Already, as he believed, the way toward his own happiness was smooth and clear. As the Count retired from this successful conference, he laughed softly to himself, nor did he pause in his unobtrusive mirth to reflect that those laugh best who laugh last. And thus it came to pass that when Jean, refreshed by sound slumber and a little cheered by hope, presented himself the next morning at Madame Carthaim's gates, fate decreed that Rose herself should open the gates to him in response to his ring, and in her own proper person should tell him that she was not at home. In explanation of this obviously inexact statement, she announced to him her mother's stern decree. Being but a giddy young person, however, and one somewhat lacking in fit reverence of maternal authority, she added, on her own account, that in half an hour or so she was going up Forth Street to the Gainsford market, and that Fore Street was a public thoroughfare upon which Monsieur d'Antemoine also had a perfect right to walk. In the course of this walk, while Jean gallantly carried the market-basket, the story that Rose already had heard from the Consul de Courtrai was told again, but told with a very different coloring. For Mademoiselle Carthaim clearly perceived how great the sacrifice had been that Jean had made for her sake, and how bravely, because it was for her sake, it had been made. There was real pathos in his voice. Once or twice he nearly broke down. Possibly it was because she did not wish him to see her eyes that she manifested so marked an interest in the shop windows as they walked along. "And so that adorable Marquis was unreal?" queried Mademoiselle Carthaim sadly and somewhat irrelevantly, when Jean had told her all. "He was not adorable. He was a disgusting beast," replied Monsieur d'Antemoine savagely. I loved him," answered Rose, turning upon Jean at last her black eyes. They did not sparkle as was their wont, but they were wonderfully lustrous and soft. Jean looked down into the market-basket and groaned. And I love him still. I think I hope that he will live always in my heart." The voice of Mademoiselle Carthaim trembled, and her hand grasped very tightly to the bag of carrots that they had been unable to make a place for in the basket. They were coming back from the market now. Jean did not look up. For the life of him, he could not keep back a sob. It was bitter hard, he felt, that out of his love for Rose should come love's wreck, and harder yet that the rival who had stolen her from him should be himself. Through the mist of his misery, he seemed to hear Rose laughing softly. Could this be so? Then indeed was the capstone set upon his grief? "Jean!" He started, and so violently that a cabbage with half a dozen potatoes after it sprang out of the basket and rolled along the pavement at her feet. His bowed head rose with a jerk, and their eyes met full. In hers there was a look half mocking, that as he gazed changed into tenderness. Into his, as he saw the change and perceived its meaning, there came a look of glad delight. "As though you could deceive me! Why, of course I knew you from the very first!" Then they collected the potatoes and the cabbage and walked slowly on, and great happiness was in their hearts. End of section 16, read by John Patterson on July 8th, 2025. Section 17 of Short Story Classics, American, Volume 2 by Various. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Patterson. Short Story Classics, American, Volume 2 by Various. Jean d'Antemoine by Thomas Allibone Janvier. Part 3. The world was a brighter world for Jean d'Antemoine when he gave into Rose's hand the market-basket on her own doorstep, and turned reluctantly away. But there still were clouds in it. Rose had admitted that 2 things were necessary before getting married could be thought of at all seriously. Something must be done by which the nose of the Consul de Courtrai would be disjointed. Something must be done to assure Madame Carthaim that Monsieur d'Antemoine, in some fashion at least a little removed from semi-starvation, could maintain a wife. It was certain that until these things were accomplished, Madame Carthaim's lofty resolution to transform her daughter into a countess, and her stern disapprobation of Jean as a social outcast, never would be overcome. As events turned out, it was the second of these requirements that was fulfilled first. Mr. Badger Brush was a very rich sporting man, whose tastes were horsey, but whose heart was in the right place. It was his delight to make or to back extraordinary wagers. Few New Yorkers have forgotten that very queer bet of his that resulted in putting high hats on all the Broadway telegraph poles. When Mr. Brush read the story of Jean d'Antemoine's wager, Therefore, he was greatly pleased with its originality. And when, later in the day, he fell in with little Conte Crayon at Jerome Park, he pressed that ingenious young newspaper man for additional particulars. And knowing the whereabouts of Mr. Badger Brush's heart, Conte Crayon did not hesitate to tell the whole story, winding up with the pointed suggestion that inasmuch as the hero of the story was an animal painter of decided, though as yet unrecognized ability, Mr. Brush could not do better than manifest his interest in a practical way by giving him an order. The sporting man rose to the suggestion with a commendable promptness and warmth. "I don't care a blank if it wasn't a bet," he said heartily. "That young man has plunk, and he deserves to be encouraged. I'll go down and see him tomorrow, and I'll order a portrait of Celeripes, a life-size $1,000 portrait. By Jove! Celeripes deserves it. After the pot of money he brought me at Long Branch, and your friend deserves it too. And I have some other horses that I want painted, and some dogs. He paints dogs, I suppose. And I know a lot of other fellows who ought to have their horses painted, and I'll start them along at him. I'll give him all the painting he can handle in the next 10 years, for it was a bet, you see, after all. Didn't he back his cleverness in disguise against the wits of the whole town? And didn't the slop-shop man put up the stakes? And didn't he just win in a canter? I should rather think he did. Of course, it was a bet, and a mighty good one at that. Gad, Crayon, it's the best thing that's been done in New York for years. It's what I call first-class cheek. I couldn't have done it better, sir, myself." Thus it fell out that half an hour after Jean got back to his studio from that memorable walk to the Gainesfort market, he had the breathtaking away felicity of booking a $1,000 order, and of receiving such obviously trustworthy assurances of many more orders that his wildest hopes of success in a moment were resolved into substantial realities. When he was alone again, he certainly would have believed that he had been dreaming, but for the fact that Mr. Badger Brush had insisted upon paying half the price of the picture down in advance, for whatever this good-hearted, horsey gentleman did, he did thoroughly well. The crisp notes, more than Jean ever had seen together in all his life before, save once when he took a dealer's check for $10 to a bank and looked through the wire screen while the bankman haughtily cashed it, lay on the table where Mr. Badger Brush had left them, and their blissful presence proved that his happiness was not a dream, but real. From the corner into which, loathingly, he had kicked it, he drew forth a bundle containing the Marquis suit. With a certain solemnity, he resumed these garments of price in which he had suffered so much torture, and, being clad, boldly presented himself to Madame Carthaim with a formal demand for her daughter's hand. And in view of the sudden and prodigious change that had come over Monsieur d'Antemoin's fortunes, almost was Madame Carthaim persuaded that the matrimonial plans which she had laid out for her daughter might be changed. Yet did she hesitate before announcing that their Median and Persian quality might be questioned, for the hope that Rose might be a countess lay very close to Madame Carthaim's heart. However, her determination was shaken, which was a great point gained. And presently, for Jean's star was triumphantly in the ascendant, it was completely destroyed. The instrument of its destruction was Mr. Badger Brush's groom, Stumps. Stumps was a talkative creature, and whenever he came down to Jean's studio, as he very often did while the portrait of Celeripes was in progress, he had a good deal to say over and above the message that he brought, as to when the horse would be free for the next sitting in the paddock at Mr. Brush's country place where Jean was painting him. And Jean, who was one of the best-natured of mortals, usually suffered Stumps to talk away until he was tired. "You might knock me down with a wisp of hay, you might indeed, sir," said the groom one morning a fortnight after the picture had been begun, the day but one, in fact, before that set for Vandyke Brown's wedding. "Yes, sir," he continued, "with a wisp of hay or even a single straw. Here I've been face to face with my own father's brother's son, and I've put out my hand to him, and he's turned away short and pretended as he didn't know me and went off. And they tells me at his lodging, for I followed him a purpose to find him out, that he calls hisself a Frenchman, and says as how his name, which it is Stumps and always has been, is Count Cbteddy de Courtrai. Jean's palette and brushes fell to the floor with a crash. Is it possible that you do tell me of the Comte Cbteddy de Courtrai? Are you then sure that you do not make one grand mistake? Is it him truly that you have seen? Him, sir? Why, in course it's him. Haven't I knowed him ever since he wasn't hiring a hoss's fetlock? Don't I tell you it was me and him's first cousins? Him? In course it's him, the gump! Then, my good Stump, you will now tell me of this wonder all. It's not much there is to tell, sir, and what there is isn't to his credit. His father was my father's brother. My father was in the hoss line out St. John's Wood way, in London, you know, sir, and his father lived in our street and was a swell barber. Uncle married a French young woman as was dressmaking and had been a lady's maid. It's along of his mother that he gets his Frenchness, you see. He was an only son, he was, and they made a lot of him, dressing him fine and coddling him, sending him to school like anything. Uncle was doing a big trade, you see, and making money fast. Then when he was a young fellow of 20 or so, and after he'd served at barbering with his father for a couple of years, he took service with young Lord Cadmium, as had his cousin, living in a villa down our way, and came to Uncle's to be barber frequent. And when Lord Cadmium went sudden-like over to the continent, wishing to give his cousin the slip, having got sick of her, Stumps he went along. That's a matter of 10 years ago, sir, and blessed if I've laid eyes on him since until I seed him here in New York today. Uncle died better than 2 year back, and having died first, and he left a tidy pot of money to Stumps. And I did hear that Stumps, who'd been barber in Paris, had give up work when he got the cash and had set up to be a gentleman, but I didn't know as he'd set up to be a count too. The like of this I never did see. And you are then sure you will swear, my good Stump, that this are the same man? Swear, sir, I swear to high, low, and all day long. But I must be going, sir. You will please to remember that the horse will be ready for you at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, sharp. Jean rushed down to Van Dyke Brown's studio for counsel as to whether he should go at once to the Count's lodgings and charge him with fraud to his face, or should make the charge first to Madame Carthane. But Brown was out. Nor was he in Old Matter's studio, though about this time he was much more likely to be there than in his own. Old Matter said that Brown had taken Rose over to Brooklyn, to the Philharmonic, and he believed that they were going to dinner at Mr. Mangan Brown's afterward, and would not be in till late, and he seemed to be pretty grumpy about it. Jean fumed and fretted away what was left of the afternoon, and a good part of the evening. At last Brown and Rose came home, and Brown with a very bad grace suffered himself to be led away from Old Matter's threshold. To do him justice, though, when he had heard the story that Jean had to tell, he was all eagerness. His advice was to make the attack instantly, and without more words they set off together, walking briskly through the chill air of the late October night. As they were passing along McDougal Street, midway between Bleecker and Houston, in front of the row of pretty houses with verandas all over their fronts, Jean suddenly gripped Brown's arm and drew him quickly within one of the little front yards and into the shadow of the high iron steps. "Look!" he said. On the other side of the street, in the light of the gas lamp that stands in the center of the block, was the Count himself. For the moment that he was beneath the gas lamp, they saw him clearly. His face was set in an expression of gloomy sternness. His rapid, resolute walk indicated a definite purpose. He carried a little bundle in his hand. "What a villain he looks," whispered Brown. "Upon my soul, I do believe that he is going to murder somebody." "Ah, the vile animal! We will pursue," answered Jaune, also in a whisper. Giving the Count a start of a dozen house fronts, they stepped out from their retreat and followed him cautiously. He walked quickly up McDougal Street until he came out on Washington Square. For a moment he paused by Sam Waugh's laundry, and then turned sharply to the left along 4th Street. At a good pace he crossed 6th Avenue, swung around the curve that 4th Street makes before beginning its preposterous journey northward, went on past the 3 little balconied houses whose fronts are on Washington Place, and so came out upon the open space where Washington Place and Barrow Street and 4th Street all run into each other. It was hereabout that Wouter Van Twiller had his tobacco farm a trifle less than 2 centuries ago. The Count stopped, as though to get his bearings, and while they waited for him to go on Brown, nudged Jaune to look at the delightfully picturesque frame house set in a deep niche between 2 high brick houses, with the wooden stair elbowing up its outside to its 3rd story. It came out wonderfully well in the moonlight, but Jaune was too much excited even to glance at it. At the next group of corners, where 4th Street crosses Grove and Christopher Streets at the point where they go sidling into each other along the slanting lines of a little park, the Count halted again. Evidently the exceeding crookedness of Greenwich Village puzzled him, as well it might. Presently a Christopher Street car came along and set him straight, and thus guided, he started resolutely westward, as though heading for the river. "Is it possible that he goes himself to drown?" suggested D'Antemouin. "No such good luck," Brown answered shortly. Coming out on what used to be called the Strand, West Street they call it now, the Count bore away from the lights of the Hoboken ferry and from the guarded docks of the White Star and anchor lines of steamers, skirted the fleet of oyster boats, and so came to the quiet pier at the foot of Perry Street, where the hay barges unload. This pier runs a long way out into the river, for it is a part of what was called Sapokamiki Point in Indian times. The Count stopped and looked cautiously around him, but his pursuers promptly crouched behind a dray and became invisible. As he went out upon the pier, though, they were close upon his heels, walking noiselessly over the loose hay and keeping himself hidden in the shadow of the barges and behind the pile of bales. At the very end of the pier he stopped. Jaune and Brown, hidden by a bale of hay, were within 5 feet of him. Their hearts were beating tremendously. There had been no tragical purpose in their minds when they started, but it certainly did look now as though they were in the thick of a tragedy. In the crisp October moonlight, the Count's face shone deathly pale. They could see the fingers of his right hand working convulsively. They could hear his labored breathing. Below him was the deep black water, lapping and rippling as the swirl of the tide sucked it into the dark, slimy recesses among the piles. In its bosom was horrible death. The Count stepped out upon the very edge of the pier, and gazed woefully down upon the swelling waters. His dismal purpose no longer admitted of doubt. Involuntarily the 2 followed him until they were close at his back. Little as they loved him, they could not suffer him thus despairingly to leave the world. But instead of casting himself over the edge of the pier, the Count slowly raised the hand that held the bundle, with the obvious intention of throwing the bundle, and whatever was the evil secret that it contained, into the river's depths. Quick as thought, Brown had seized the appraised arm, and Jaune had settled upon the other arm with a grip like a vice. "No, you don't, my boy. Let's see what it is before it goes overboard. Hold fast, D'Antemouin." The Count struggled furiously, but hopelessly. "It's no use. You may as well give in, Stumps." As Brown uttered his name, the Count suddenly became limp. The little bundle that he had clutched tightly through the struggle dropped from his nerveless hand and fell open as it struck the ground. And there, gleaming in the moonlight, a brace of razors, a stubby brush, a stout pair of shears, lay loosely in the folds of a barber's jacket. And this was the sorry climax to the brilliant romance of the proscribed Bonapartist, the Count Cbteddy de Courtrai. Jaune, who was a generous-hearted young fellow, was for setting free his crestfallen rival at once, and so having done with him. Brown took a more statesmanlike view of the situation. "We will let him go after he has owned up to Madame Carthaim what a fraud he is," he said. The Count winced when this sentence was pronounced, but he uttered no remonstrance. The shock of the discovery had completely demoralized him. It was after midnight when they reached Madame Carthaim's dwelling, and Rose herself, with her hair done up in curl papers, opened the door for them. When she recognized the three visitors and perceived that the Count was in custody, and at the same moment remembered her curl papers, on her face the gaze of astonishment and the blush of maidenly modesty contended for the right of way. Madame Carthaim fairly was in bed, as was evident from the spirited conversation between herself and her vivacious daughter that was perfectly audible through the folding doors which separated the little parlor from her bedroom. It was evident, also, that she was indisposed to rise. However, her indisposition was overcome, and in the course of 20 minutes or so she appeared arrayed in a frigid dignity and a loose wrapper. Rose, meanwhile, had taken off her curl papers, and Jaune regarded her tumbled hair with ecstasy. The tribunal being assembled, the prisoner was placed at the bar, and the trial began. It was an eminently irregular trial, looking at it from a legal point of view, for the verbal evidence all was hearsay. But it also was extra-legal in that it was brief and decisive. Brown gave his testimony, in the shape of a repetition of the story that Jaune had told him had been told by Mr. Badger Brush's groom, and when this was concluded, Jaune produced the jacket, razors, shears, and shaving brush, and stated the circumstances under which they had been found. Then the prosecution rested. Being questioned by the court, that is to say by Madame Carthaim, in his own defense, the Count replied gloomily that he hadn't any. "When I saw that horse fellow," he said, "I knew that I was likely to get into trouble, and that was the reason why I wanted to get rid of these things. And now the game is up. It is all true. I was a barber. I am not a count. My real name is Stumps." Then it was that Madame Carthaim, blissfully ignorant of the fact that she had neglected to remove her nightcap, stood up in her place with her wrapper gathered about her in a statuesque fashion, and in a tragic tone uttered the single word, "Sortez!" And the Count went. Out, out into the chill and gloom of night went the false Count, never to return, and with him went Madame Carthaim's fond hope that her daughter would be a countess, which also was the last barrier in the way of Jean d'Antemoin's love. Perceiving that the force of fate inexorably was pressing upon her, Madame Carthaim, still in her nightcap, bestowed upon Rose and Jaune the maternal blessing in a manner that, even allowing for the nightcap, was both stately and severe. As at Van Dyke Brown's wedding, Jean d'Antemoin was radiantly magnificent in the Marquis suit, adding splendor to the ceremony and rendering himself most pleasing in the eyes of Rose Carthaim. So, a month later, he was yet more radiant when he wore the famous suit again, in the church of St. Vincent de Paul, and was himself married. Crayon brought Mr. Badger Brush down to the wedding, and the groom came too, and the tailor got wind of it, and came without being asked, and had to be implored not to work it up into an advertisement, as he very much wanted to do. Mrs. Van Dyke Brown, just home from her wedding journey, was the first, after the kiss of Madame Carthaim had been sternly bestowed, to kiss the bride, and Mr. Badger Brush irreverently whispered to Crayon that he wished, by gad, he had her chance. End of section 17, read by John Patterson on July 16th, 2025. Section 18 of Short Story Classics, American, Volume 2, by Various. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by John Patterson. Short Story Classics, American, Volume 2, by Various. Old Stracted by Thomas Nelson Page.
Oh, little Ephraim, oh, little Ephraim, if you don't come long here, boy, and rock this child, I'll bust your head open,
screamed the high-pitched voice of a woman, breaking the stillness of the summer evening. She had just come to the door of the little cabin, where she was now standing, anxiously scanning the space before her, while a baby's plaintive wail rose and fell within with wearing monotony. The log cabin, set in a gall in the middle of an old field all grown up in sassafras, was not a very inviting-looking place. A few hens loitering about the new hen-house, a brood of half-grown chickens picking in the grass and watching the door, and a runty pig tied to a stub, were the only signs of thrift. Yet the face of the woman cleared up as she gazed about her, and afar off, where the gleam of green made a pleasant spot, where the corn grew in the river bottom, for it was her home, and best of all she thought it belonged to them. A rumble of distant thunder caught her ear, and she stepped down and took a well-worn garment from the clothesline, stretched between two dogwood forks, and having, after a clean glance down the path through the bushes, satisfied herself that no one was in sight, she returned to the house, and the baby's voice rose louder than before. The mother, as she set out her ironing table, raised a dirge-like hymn, which she chanted, partly from habit and partly in self-defense. She ironed carefully the ragged shirt she had just taken from the line, and then, after some search, finding a needle and cotton, she drew a chair to the door and proceeded to mend the garment.
"Dis the only shirt old Stracted got,"
she said, as if in apology to herself for being so careful. The clouds slowly gathered over the pines in the direction of the path. The fowls carefully tripped up the path, and after a prudent pause at the hole, disappeared one by one within. The chickens picked in a gradually contracting circuit, and finally one or two stole furtively to the cabin door, and after a brief reconnaissance came in, and fluttered up the ladder to the loft, where they had been born and yet roosted. Once more the baby's voice prevailed, and once more the woman went to the door, and looking down the path screamed,
"Oh, little Ephraim, oh, little Ephraim."
"Ma'am," came the not very distant answer from the bushes.
"Why ain't you come long here, boy, and rock this child?"
"Yes'm, I comin'," came the answer. She waited and watched until there emerged from the bushes a queer little caravan, headed by a small brat who staggered, under the weight of another apparently nearly as large and quite as black as himself, while several more of various degrees of diminutiveness struggled along behind.
"Ain't you hear me calling you, boy? You better come when I call you. I'll tear you all to pieces,"
pursued the woman in the angriest of keys, her countenance, however, appearing unruffled. The head of the caravan stooped and deposited his burden carefully on the ground. Then, with a comical look of mingled alarm and penitence, he slowly approached the door, keeping his eye watchfully on his mother, and picking his opportunity, slipped in past her, dodging skillfully just enough to escape a blow which she aimed at him, and which would have slapped him flat had it struck him, but which, in truth, was intended merely to warn and keep him in wholesome fear, and was purposely aimed high enough to miss him, allowing for the certain dodge. The culprit, having stifled the whimper with which he was prepared, flung himself on to the foot of the rough plank cradle, and began to rock it violently and noisily, using one leg as a lever, and singing an accompaniment, of which the only words that rose above the noise of the rockers were,
"Baby, don't you cry. Go to sleep, little baby."
And sure enough, the baby stopped crying and went to sleep. F watched his mammy furtively as she scraped away the ashes and laid the thick pone of dough on the hearth and shoveled the hot ashes upon it. Supper would be ready directly, and it was time to propitiate her. He bethought himself of a message.
"Mammy, old Stracted say you must bring he shut. He say he marster comin' tonight." "How he say he is?" inquired the woman with some interest. "He ain't say, just say he want a shut. He something is comical. He layin' down in the bed."
Then, having relieved his mind, F went to sleep in the cradle.
"Layin' down in the bed,"
quoted the woman to herself as she moved about the room.
"I ain't never heard 'bout dat before. Dat certainly is a comical old man anyways. He say he used to live on dis plantation, and yet he always talking 'bout the great house and the fine carriages dey used to have, and 'bout he marster comin' to buy him back. Dey ain't never been no great house on dis place, not since I know nothing 'bout it, 'cept the overseer house where dat man live. I hear Ephraim say Aunt Dinah tell him the old house where used to be on the hill where that great oak tree is in the pines burnt down the year he was born, and he old marster had to live in the overseer house, and hit break he heart, and he take all he niggers, and that's the way he come to belongs to we all. But that old man ain't know nothing 'bout that house, 'cause hit burnt down. I wonder where he did come from," she pursued. "And what he sure enough name? He surely couldn't been named Old Stracted just so. Dat ain't no name tall. Yet if he ain't Stracted, 'tain't nobody is. He ain't even know he own name," she continued presently. "Say, he master'll know him when he come, and know the folks is free. Say he marster go buy him back in the summer and carry him home, and 'bout the money he gon' give him. If he got any money, I wonder he live down there in dat evil spirit hole."
And the woman glanced around with great complacency on the picture-pasted walls of her own, by no means sumptuously furnished house. "Money," she repeated aloud as she began to rake in the ashes. "He ain't got nothin'. I got to carry him piece of dis bread now." And she went off into a dream of what they would do when the big crop on their land should be all in, and the last payment made on the house, of what she would wear, and how she would dress the children, and the appearance she would make at the meeting, not reflecting that the sum they had paid for the property had never, even with all their stinting, amounted to any 1 year to more than a few dollars over the rent charged for the place, and that the $800 yet due on it was more than they could make at the present rate in a lifetime.
"If Ephraim just had a mule, or even somebody to help him," she thought. "But he ain't got nothin'. De child ain't big enough to do nothin' but eat. He ain't not no brothers, and he daddy took away and sold down Soof the same time my own marster were dead by him. That's what I always hear him say, and I know he's dead long before this, 'cause I hear him say these Virginia niggers can't stand hit long deer. Hit so hot, hit frizzle him up, and I reckon he die before he old marster, where I hear say die of a broken heart directly after de take him niggers and sell him before he face. I hear Aunt Dinah say dat, and dat he mightily sought on his old servants, spressly on Ephraim daddy were named Little Ephraim, and were used to wait on him. Dis must have been a great place dem days, 'cording to what dee say," she went on. "Dee say he certainly lived strong, was just rich as cream, and weighed he blue coat and brass buttons, and lived in dat old house where was up where the pines is now, and were burnt down like he owned the will. And now look at it, dat man owned it all, and cutting all the woods off it. He don't know nothing 'bout black folks, ain't never been fotch up with 'em. Whoever here he named for, he come here and buy the place and move into overseer house and charge we all $800 for this land just 'cause it got little pieces of bottom on it and $48 rent besides, with the old stingy wife where even give away buttermilk. An expression of mingled disgust and contempt concluded the reflection. She took the ash cake out of the ashes, slapped it first on one side, then on the other with her hand, dusted it with her apron, and walked to the door and poured a gourd of water from the pagan over it. Then she divided it in half. One half she set up against the side of the chimney, the other she broke up into smaller pieces and distributed among the children, dragging the sleeping F, limp and soaked with sleep, from the cradle to receive his share. Her manner was not rough, was perhaps even tender, but she used no caresses, as a white woman would have done under the circumstances. It was only toward the baby at the breast that she exhibited any endearments. Her nearest approach to it with the others was when she told them, as she portioned out the ash cake. "Mammy ain't got nothing else, but never mind, she gonna have plenty of good meat next year when Daddy done pay for he land. Hi, who dat out there?" she said suddenly. "Run to the door, son, and see who dat comin'," and the whole tribe rushed to inspect the newcomer. It was, as she suspected, her husband, and as soon as he entered she saw that something was wrong. He dropped into a chair and sat in moody silence, the picture of fatigue, physical and mental. After waiting for some time, she asked indifferently, "What de matter?" "Dat man." "What he done do now?" The query was sharp with suspicion. "He say he ain't gonna let me have my land." "He's a half-strainer," said the woman with sudden anger. "How he gonna help it? Ain't you got crap on it?" She felt that there must be a defense against such an outrage. "He say he ain't gonna wait no longer, dat I was to have till Christmas to finish paying for it, and I ain't do it, and now he done change his mind." "Tell dis Christmas comin'," said his wife with the positiveness of one accustomed to expound contracts. "Yes, but I tell you he say he done change his mind." The man had evidently given up all hope. He was dead beat. "The crap's yarn," said she, affected by his surrender, but prepared only to compromise. "He say he gon' take all dat for the rent, and dat he gon' drive old Stracted away too. He ain't nothing but po' white trash." It expressed her supreme contempt. "He say he'll give me just 1 week more to pay him all he asks for it," continued he, forced to a correction by her intense feeling, and the instinct of a man to defend the absent from a woman's attack, and perhaps in the hope that she might suggest some escape. "He ain't nothing 'cept po' white trash," she repeated. "How you go raise $800 at once? D'ee care nobody do dat? Guard him out. He ain't got good sense." "You ain't see dat corn lately, is you?" he asked. "Hit just as rank. You can almost see it growing if you look at it good. That's strong land. I know that when I buy it." He knew it was gone now, but he had been in the habit of calling it his in the past 3 years, and it did him good to claim the ownership a little longer. "I wonder where Marse Johnny is," said the woman. He was the son of her former owner, and now, finding her proper support failing her, she instinctively turned to him. "He wouldn't let him turn we all out. He ain't got nothing, and if he is, he can't get it in a week," said Ephraim. "Can't you take it in the cart?" "That's where he say he gonna have it if I don't get out," said her husband despairingly. Her last defense was gone. "Ain't you hungry?" she inquired. "What you got?" "I just gone kill a chicken for you."
It was her nearest approach to tenderness, and he knew it was a mark of special attention, for all the chickens and eggs had for the past 3 years gone to swell the fund which was to buy the home, and it was only on special occasions that one was spared for food. The news that he was to be turned out of his home had fallen on him like a blow, and had stunned him. He could make no resistance, he could form no plans. He went into a rough estimate as he waited.
Let me see. I done worked for 3 years this Christmas doggone. How much does that make? And $4 and $5 and $2 and a half last Christmas from the chickens and all them ducks I done sell his wife and the washing I been doing for him. How much is that? Supplemented his wife. That's what I say.
His wife endeavored vainly to remember the amount she had been told it was, but the unaccounted-for washing changed the sum and destroyed her reliance on the result. And as the chicken was now approaching perfection and required her undivided attention, she gave up the arithmetic and applied herself to her culinary duties. Ephraim also abandoned the attempt and waited in a reverie in which he saw corn stand so high and rank over his land that he could scarcely distinguish the bulk, and a stable and barn and a mule, or maybe 2, it was a possibility, and 2 cows which his wife would milk, and a green wagon driven by his boys while he took it easy and gave orders like a master, and a clover patch and wheat, and he saw the yellow grain waving, and heard his sons sing the old harvest song of cool water while they swung their cradles and...
You say he gon' turn old Stracted out too? Inquired his wife, breaking the spell.
The chicken was done now, and her mind reverted to the all-engrossing subject.
Yes, say he tired of old Stracted nigger living on his place and paying no rent. Good God Almighty! Pay rent for that old pile of logs. Ain't he been mending his shoes and harness for rent all these years? 'Twill kill that old man to turn him out that house, said Ephraim. He ain't never stay away from dear an hour since he come here. Sonny 'twill,
assented his wife. Then she added, in reply to the rest of the remark,
Never mind, then we'll see what he got in there.
To a woman, that was at least some compensation. Ephraim's thoughts had taken a new direction.
He always feared he must'd come for him while he away, he said, in mere continuance of his last remark. He sent me word he marched a comin' tonight, and he want he should, said his wife, as she handed him his supper.
Ephraim's face expressed more than interest. It was tenderness which softened the rugged lines as he sat looking into the fire. Perhaps he thought of the old man's loneliness, and of his own father torn away and sold so long ago, before he could even remember, and perhaps very dimly, of the beauty of the sublime devotion of this poor old creature to his love and his trust, holding steadfast beyond memory, beyond reason, after the knowledge even of his own identity and of his very name was lost. The woman caught the contagion of his sympathy.
"The child say he mighty comical, and he layin' down in the bed," she said.
Ephraim rose from his seat.
"Where you goin'?" "I must go see 'bout him," he said simply. "Ain't you gon' finish eatin'?" "I gon' carry this to him." "Well, I can cook you another when you come back," said his wife with ready acquiescence.
In a few minutes they were on the way, going single file down the path through the sassafras, along which little Eph and his followers had come an hour before, the man in the lead and his wife following, and according to the custom of their race, carrying the bundles, one the surrendered supper, and the other the neatly folded and well-patched shirt in which old Stracted hoped to meet his long-expected loved ones. As they came in sight of the ruinous little hut, which had been the old man's abode since his sudden appearance in the neighborhood a few years after the war, they observed that the bench beside the door was deserted, and that the door stood ajar, two circumstances which neither of them remembered ever to have seen before. For in all the years in which he had been their neighbor, old Stracted had never admitted anyone within his door, and had never been known to leave it open. In mild weather, he occupied a bench outside, where he either cobbled shoes for his neighbors, accepting without question anything they paid him, or else sat perfectly quiet, with the air of a person waiting for someone. He held only the briefest communication with anybody, and was believed by some to have intimate relations with the Evil One in his tumble-down hut, which he was particular to keep closely daubed, was thought by such as took this view of the matter to be the temple where he practiced his unholy rites. For this reason, and because the little cabin, surrounded by dense pines and covered with vines which the popular belief held poisonous, was the most desolate abode a human being could have selected, most of the dwellers in that section gave the place a wide berth, especially toward nightfall, and old Stracted would probably have suffered but for the charity of Ephraim and his wife, who, although often wanting the necessaries of life themselves, had long divided it with their strange neighbor. Yet even they had never been admitted inside his door, and knew no more of him than the other people about the settlement knew. His advent in the neighborhood had been mysterious. The first that was known of him was one summer morning, when he was found sitting on the bench beside the door of this cabin, which had long been unoccupied and left to decay. He was unable to give any account of himself, except that he was always declared that he had been sold by some one other than his master from that plantation, that his wife and boy had been sold to some other person at the same time for $1,200, he was particular as to the amount, and that his master was coming in the summer to buy him back and take him home, and would bring him his wife and child when he came. Everything since that day was a blank to him, and as he could not tell the name of his master or wife, or even his own name, and as no one was left old enough to remember him, the neighborhood having been entirely deserted after the war, he simply passed as a harmless old lunatic laboring under a delusion. He was devoted to children, and Ephraim's small brood were his chief delight. They were not at all afraid of him, and whenever they got a chance, they would slip off and steal down to his house, where they might be found any time squatting about his feet, listening to his accounts of his expected visit from his master, and what he was going to do afterward. It was all of a great plantation, and fine carriages and horses, and a house with his wife and the boy. This was all that was known of him, except that once a stranger, passing through the country and hearing the name Old Stracted, said that he heard a similar one once, long before the war, in one of the Louisiana parishes, where the man roamed at will, having been bought of the trader by the gentleman who owned him, for a small price, on account of his infirmity. "Is you going, India?" asked the woman, as they approached the hut. "Hi, yes, 'tain't none goin' hurt you, and you say Ephraim say he be layin' in the bed?" he replied, his mind having evidently been busy on the subject. "And mighty comical," she corrected him, with exactness born of apprehension. "Well, I feared he's sick." "I ain't never been in India," she persisted. "Ain't the child been in India?" "Dee say Stracted folks un hurt children. Dat old man un hurt nobody. He just tame as a old tomcat." "I wonder he ain't feared to live in dat lonesome old house by hisself. I just live, stay in a graveyard at once. I ain't wonder folks say he sees spirits in dat hainty-looking place." She came up by her husband's side at the suggestion. "I wonder he done go home." "Where he got any home to go to 'cept heaven?" said Ephraim. "What was you mammy name, Ephraim?" "Mimi," said he simply. They were at the cabin now, and a brief pause of doubt ensued. It was perfectly dark inside the door, and there was not a sound. The bench where they had heretofore held their only communication with their strange neighbor was lying on its side in the weeds, which grew up to the very walls of the ruinous cabin. And a lizard suddenly ran over it, and with a little rustle disappeared under the rotting ground sill. To the woman it was an ill omen. She glanced furtively behind her and moved nearer her husband's side. She noticed that the cloud above the pines was getting a faint yellow tinge on its lower border, while it was very black above them. It filled her with dread, and she was about to call her husband's notice to it, when a voice within arrested their attention. It was very low, and they both listened in awed silence, watching the door meanwhile as if they expected to see something supernatural spring from it.
"Never mind, just wait. 'Tain't so long now. He'll be here directly," said the voice. "That's what he say. Go and come and buy me back. Then we go home."
In their endeavor to catch the words, they moved nearer and made a slight noise. Suddenly, the low, earnest tone changed to one full of eagerness.
"Who dat?"
was called in sharp inquiry.
"'Tain't nobody but me and Polly, old Stracted," said Ephraim, pushing the door slightly wider open and stepping in.
They had an indistinct idea that the poor, deluded creature had fancied them his longed-for loved ones, yet it was a relief to see him bodily.
"Who you say you is?"
inquired the old man feebly.
"Me and Polly." "I done bring you shut home," said the woman, as if supplementing her husband's reply. "Hit all brand clean, and I done patch it." "Oh, I thought," said the voice sadly.
They knew what he thought. Their eyes were now accustomed to the darkness, and they saw that the only article of furniture which the room contained was the wretched bed or bench on which the old man was stretched. The light sifting through the chinks in the roof enabled them to see his face, and that it had changed much in the last 24 hours, and an instinct told them that he was near the end of his long waiting.
"How is you all Stracted?" asked the woman. "Dat ain't my name,"
answered the old man promptly. It was the first time he had ever disowned the name.
"Well, how is you all what I going to call you?"
asked she with feeble finesse.
"I don't know. He can tell you."
"Who?"
"Who? Marster. He know it. Old Stracted ain't know it, but dat ain't nothing. He know it. Got it set down in the book. I just waiting for him now."
A hush fell on the little audience. They were in full sympathy with him, and knowing no way of expressing it, kept silence. Only the breathing of the old man was audible in the room. He was evidently nearing the end.
"I'm mighty tired of waiting," he said pathetically. "Look out there and see if you see anybody," he added suddenly.
Both of them obeyed, and then returned and stood silent. They could not tell him no. Presently the woman said,
"Don't you warm put you shut on?"
"What did you say my name was?" he said.
"Old
She paused at the look of pain on his face, shifted uneasily from one foot to the other, and relapsed into embarrassed silence.
"Never mind, de'll know it. De'll know me doubt any name, undi?"
he appealed wistfully to them both. The woman, for answer, unfolded the shirt. He moved feebly, as if in assent.
"I so tired of waiting,"
he whispered.
"Done most gin out, and he won't come, but I thought I hear little F today."
There was a faint inquiry in his voice.
"Yes, he was here." "Was he?"
The languid form became instantly alert. The tired face took on a look of eager expectancy.
"Here, give me my shirt quick. I knowed it. Wait, go over there, son. Give me that money. He'll be here directly."
They thought his mind wandered, and merely followed the direction of his eyes with theirs.
"Go over there quick. Don't you hear me?"
and to humor him, Ephraim went over to the corner indicated.
Reach up there and run your hand in under the second jice. It's all in there, he said to the woman. $1,200. That's what they went for. I worked night and day 40 years to save that money for master. You know, they take all he land and all he niggers and turn him out in the old field. I put 10 deer against he come. You ain't know he coming this evening, is you? Here, help me on with that shirt, gal. I stand here talking and maybe old master waiting. Push the door open so you can see. 40 years ago, he murmured as Polly jammed the door back and returned to his side. 40 years ago, they come and leveled on me. Master suddenly did cry. Never mind, he said. I coming right down into summer to buy you back and bring you home. He's coming too, never told me a lie in any life. Coming this evening. Make haste. This in tremulous eagerness to the woman who had involuntarily caught the feeling and was now with eager and ineffectual haste trying to button his shirt. An exclamation from her husband caused her to turn around as he stepped into the light and held up an old sock filled with something. Here, hold your apron, said the old man to Polly, who gathered up the lower corners of her apron and stood nearer the bed. Pour it in, dear. This is to Ephraim, who mechanically obeyed. He pulled off the string and poured it into his wife's lap, the heap of glittering coin, gold and silver more than their eyes had ever seen before. It's all, dear, said the old man confidently, as if he were rendering an account. I've been saving it ever since they took me away. I so busy saving it, I ain't had time to eat it, but I ain't hungry now. I have plenty when I get home. He sank back exhausted. Oh, master be glad to see me? He asked presently, in pathetic simplicity. You know we grewed up together. I've been waiting so long, I fear thee most done forget me. You reckon thee is? He asked the woman appealingly. No, sah, dee ain't forget you, she said comfortingly. I know dee ain't, he said reassured. That's what he tell me. He ain't never gon' forget me. The reaction had set in, and his voice was so feeble now it was scarcely audible. He was talking rather to himself than to them, and finally he sank into a doze. A painful silence reigned in the little hut, in which the only sign was the breathing of the dying man. A single shaft of light stole down under the edge of the slowly passing cloud and slipped up to the door. Suddenly the sleeper waked with a start and gazed around. "It getting mighty dark," he whispered faintly. "You reckon they'll get here 'fore dark?" The light was dying from his eyes. "Ephraim," said the woman softly to her husband. The effect was electrical. "Hish, you hear that?" exclaimed the dying man eagerly. "Ephraim," she repeated. The rest was drowned by old Stracted's joyous exclamation. "God, I knowed it!" he cried, suddenly rising upright, and with beaming face, stretching both arms toward the door. "There he come! Now watch him smile! All y'all just stand back! Here the one you looking for! Master, Mimi, he is little Ephraim!" And with a smile on his face, he sank back into his son's arms. The evening sun, dropping on the instant to his setting, flooded the room with light, but as Ephraim gently eased him down and drew his arm from around him, it was the light of the unending morning that was on his face. His master had at last come for him, and after his long waiting, old Stracted had indeed gone home. End of section 18, read by John Patterson on June 25th, 2025.
Section 19 of Short Story Classics, American, Volume 2, by Various. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Drew Rice. Short Story Classics, American, Volume 2, by Various. Our Consul at Carlsruhe, by F. J. Stimson, J.S. of Dale. Part 1. Died, in Baden, Germany, the 22nd instant, Charles Austin Pinckney, late U.S. Consul at Carlsruhe, aged 60 years. There. Most stories of men's lives end with the epitaph, but this of Pinckney's shall begin there. If we, as haply God or devil could unroof the houses of men's souls, if their visible works were of their hearts rather than their brains, we should know strange things. And this alone, of all the possible, is certain. For bethink you how men appear to their Creator, as he looks down into the soul, that matrix of their visible lives we find so hard to localize, and yet so sure to be. For all of us believe in self, and few of us but are forced, one way or another, to grant existence to some selves outside of us. Can you not fancy that men's souls, like their farms, would show here a patch of grain, and there the tares, there the weeds, and here the sowing? Over this place the rain has been, and that other, to one looking down upon it from afar, seems brown and desolate, wasted by fire or made arid by the drought? In this man's life is a poor beginning, but a better end. In this other's we see the foundations, the staging, and the schemes of mighty structures, now stopped, given over, or abandoned, of vessels fashioned for the world's seas, now rotting on the stocks. Of this one all seems ready but the launching. Of that the large keelson only has been laid, but both alike have died unborn, and the rain falls upon them, and the mosses grow. The sound of labor is far off, and the scene of work is silent. Small laws make great changes, slight differences of adjustment, and quick in death. Small, now, they would seem to us, but to the infinite mind all things small and great are alike. The spore of rust in the ear is very slight, but a famine in the corn will shake the world. Pinckney's life the world called lazy. His leisure was not fruitful, and his 60 years of life were but a gentleman's. Some slight lesion may have caused paralysis of energy, some clot of heart's blood pressed upon the soul. I make no doubt our doctors could diagnose it, if they knew a little more. Tall and slender, he had a strange face, a face with a young man's beauty. His white hair gave a charm to the rare smile, like new snow to the spring, and the slight stoop with which he walked was but a grace the more. In short, Pinckney was interesting. Women raved about him, young men fell in love with him, and if he was selfish, the fault lay between him and his Maker, not visible to other men. There are 3 things that make a man interesting in his old age. The first, being heroism, we may put aside, but the other 2 are regret and remorse. Now, Mr. Pinckney's fragrance was not of remorse. Women and young men would have called it heroism. It may have been. As much heroism as could be practiced in 36 years of Carlsruhe. Why Carlsruhe? That was the keynote of inquiry, and no one knew. Old men spoke unctuously of youthful scandals. Women dreamed. I suspect even Mrs. Pinckney wondered, about as much as the plowed field may wonder at the silence of the autumn. But Pinckney limped gracefully about the sleepy avenues which converge at the Grand Duke's palace, like a wakeful page in the castle of the Sleeping Beauty. Pinckney was a friend of the Grand Duke's, and perhaps it was a certain American flavor persisting in his manners which made him seem the only man at the Baden court who met his arch-serene altitude on equal terms. For one who had done nothing and possessed little, Pinckney certainly preserved a marvelous personal dignity. His 4 daughters were all married to scions of Teutonic nobility, and each one in turn had asked him for the Pinckney arms and courted them into the appropriate check square with as much grave satisfaction as he felt for the far-off patch of Hohenzollern or of Habsburg in sinister chief. Pinckney had laughed at it and referred them to the Declaration of Independence, Clause the First, but his wife had copied them from some spoon or sugar bowl. She was very fond of Pinckney, and no more questioned him why they always lived in Carlsruhe than a Persian would the sun for rising east. Now and then they went to Baden, and her cup was full. Pinckney died of a cold, unostentatiously, and was buried like a gentleman, though the Grand Duke actually wanted to put the court in mourning for 3 days, and consulted with his chamberlain whether it would do. Mrs. Pinckney had preceded him by some 6 years, but she was an appendage, and her husband's deference had always seemed in Carlsruhe a trifle strained. It was only in these last 6 years that anyone had gossiped of remorse in answer to the sphinx-like question of his marble brow. Such questions vex the curious. Furrows trouble nobody. Money matters are enough for them. But white smoothness in old age is a bait, and tickles curiosity. Some said at home he was a devil and beat his wife. But Pinckney never beat his wife. Late in the last twilight of her life, she had called him to her, and excluded even the 4 daughters, with their stout and splendid barons. Then, alone with him, she looked to him and smiled, and suddenly his gentleman's heart took a jump, and the tears fell on her still soft hands. I suppose some old road was opened again in the grey matter of his brain. Mrs. Pinckney smiled the more strongly and said, not quite so terribly as Mrs. Amos Barton, "Have I made you happy, dearest Charles?" And Charles, the perfect-mannered, said she had, but said it stammering. "Then," said she, "I die very happily, dear." And she did. And Pinckney continued to live at Carlsruhe. The only activities of Pinckney's mind were critical. He was a wonderful orator, but he rarely spoke. People said he could have been a great writer, but he never wrote, at least nothing original. He was the art and continental drama critic of several English and American reviews. In music, he was a Wagnerian, which debarred him from writing of it except in German. But the little court theatre at Carlsruhe has Wagner's portrait over the drop curtain, and the Consul's box was never empty when the mighty heathen legends were declaimed or the holy music of the Grail was sung. In fiction of the earnest sort and poetry, Pinckney's critical pen showed a marvelous magic, striking the scant springs of the author's inspiration through the most rocky ground of incident or style. He had a curious sympathy with youthful tenderness. But after all, as every young compatriot who went to Baden said, what the deuce and all did he live in Baden for? Miles Breeze had said it in '50 when he made the grand tour with his young wife and dined with him in Baden-Baden. That is, when Breeze dined with him, for his young wife was indisposed and could not go. Miles Breeze Jr. had said it as late as '76, when he went abroad, ostensibly for instruction after leaving college. He had letters to Mr. Pinckney, who was very kind to the young Baltimorean, and greatly troubled the Grand Duke, his Serenity, by presenting him as a relative of the Bonapartes. Many another American had said it, and even some leading politicians. He might have held office at home, but Pinckney continued to live in Carlsruhe. His critical faculties seemed sharpened after his wife's death as his hair grew whiter. And if you remember how he looked before, you must have noticed that the greatest change was in the expression of his face. There was one faint downward line at either side of his mouth, and the counterpart at the eyes. A doubtful line which, faint as it was graven, gave a strange amount of shading to the face. And in speaking of him still earlier, you must remember to take your India rubber and rub out this line from his face. This done, the face is still serious, but it has a certain light, a certain air of confidence, of determination, regretful though it be, which makes it loved by women. Women can love a desperate, but never begin to love a beaten, cause. Women fell in love with Pinckney, for the lightning does strike twice in the same place. But his race was rather that of Lohengrin than of the Asra, and he saw it, or seemed to see it, not. Still, in these times those downward lines had not come, and there was a certain sober light in his face, as of a sorrowful triumph. This was an epoch of his greatest interestingness to women. When he first came to Carlsruhe, he was simply the new consul, nothing more. A handsome young man, almost in his honeymoon, with a young and pretty wife. He had less presence in those days, and seemed absorbed in his new home, or deeply sunk in something. People at first fancied he was a poet, meditating a great work, which, finished, he would soon leave Carlsruhe. He never was seen to look at a woman, not overmuch at his wife, and was not yet popular in society. But it was true that he was newly married. He was married in Boston in 43 or 4 to Emily Austen, a far-off cousin of his, whom he had known, he himself was a Carolinian, during his 4 years at Cambridge. For his 4 years in Cambridge were succeeded by 2 more at law school. Then he won a great case against Mr. Choate, and was narrowly beaten in an election for Congress. After that, it surprised no one to hear the announcement of his engagement to Miss Austen, for his family was unexceptionable and he had a brilliant future. The marriage came in the fall, rather sooner than people expected, at King's Chapel. They went abroad, as was natural, and then he surprised his friends and hers by accepting his consulship and staying there, and they were imperceptibly, gradually, slowly, and utterly forgotten. The engagement came out in the spring of 43, and in June of that year, young Pinckney had gone to visit his fiancée at Newport. Had you seen him there, you would have seen him in perhaps the brightest role that fate has yet permitted on this world's stage. A young man, a lover, rich, gifted and ambitious, of social position unquestioned in South Carolina and the Old Bay State. All the world loved him as a lover. The many envied him, the upper few desired him. Handsome he has always remained. And the world did look to him as bright as he to the world. He was in love, as he told himself, and Miss Austen was a lovable girl. And the other things he was dimly conscious of, and he had a long vacation ahead of him, and was to be married late in the autumn, and he walked up from the wharf in Newport, swinging his cane, and thinking on these pleasant things. Newport in those days was not the paradise of cottages and carousels, of lawns and laces, of New Yorkers and Nevada miners. It was the time of big hotels and balls, of Southern planters, of Julien's orchestras, and of hotel hops, such a barbarous time as the wandering New Yorker still may find, lingering on the simple shores of Maine, sunning in the verdant valleys of the Green Mountains. In short, it was Arcadia, not Belgravia. And you must remember that Pinckney, who was dressed in the latest style, wore a blue broadcloth frock coat, cut very low and tight in the waist, with a coat collar rolling back to reveal a vast expanse of shirt bosom, surmounted by a cravat of awful splendor, bow-knotted and blue-fringed. His trousers were of white duck, his boots lacquered, and he carried a gold-tipped cane in his hand. So he walked up the narrow old streets from the wharf, making a sunshine in those shady places. It was the hottest hour of midsummer afternoon, not a soul was stirring, and Pinckney was left to his own pleasant meditations. He got up the hill and turned into the park by the old mill. Over opposite was the great hotel, its piazzas deserted, silent even to the hotel band. But one flutter of a white dress he saw beneath the trees, and then it disappeared behind them, causing Pinckney to quicken his steps. He thought he knew the shape and motion, and he followed it until he came upon it, suddenly behind the trees, and it turned. A young girl of wonderful beauty, rare, erect carriage, and eyes of a strange violet gray, full of much meaning. This was all Pinckney had time to note. It was no one he had ever seen before. He had gone up like a hunter, sure of his game and too far in it to retract. The embarrassment of the situation was such that Pinckney forgot all his cleverness of manner and blurted out the truth like any schoolboy. "I beg pardon. I was looking for Miss Austen," said he, and he raised his hat. A delightful smile of merriment curled the beauty's lips. "My acquaintance with Miss Austen is too slight to justify my finding her for you, but I wish you all the success in your efforts," she said, and vanished, leaving the promising young lawyer to blush at his own awkwardness and wonder who she was. As she disappeared, he only saw that her hair was a lustrous coil of pale gold brown, borne proudly. He soon found Emily Austen, and forgot the beauty, as he gave his betrothed a kiss and saw her color heighten. And in the afternoon they took a long drive. It was only at tea, as he was sitting at table with the Austens in the long dining room, that someone walked in like a goddess, and it was she. He asked her name, and they told him it was a Miss Warfield of Baltimore. She was engaged to a Mr. Breeze. In the evening there was a ball, and as they were dancing, for everyone danced in those days, he saw her again, sitting alone this time and unattended. She was looking eagerly across the room, through dancers and beyond, and in her eyes was the deepest look of sadness Pinckney had ever seen in a girl's face, a look such as he had thought no girl could feel. A moment after, and it was gone, as someone spoke to her, and Pinckney wondered if he had not been mistaken, so fleeting was it, and so strange. An acquaintance, one of those men who delight to act as brokers of acquaintances, who had noticed his gaze, came up. "That is the famous Miss Mary Warfield," said he. "Shall I not introduce you?" "No," said Pinckney, and he turned away rudely. To be rude when you like is perhaps one of the choicest prerogatives of a good social position. The acquaintance stared after him as he went back to Miss Austen, and then went up and spoke to Miss Warfield himself. A moment after, Pinckney saw her look over at him with some interest, and he wondered if the man had been ass enough to tell her. Pinckney was sitting with Emily Austen, and after another moment he saw Miss Warfield look at her. Then her glance seemed to lose its interest. Her eyelids drooped, and Pinckney could see from her interlocutor's manner that he was put to his trumps to keep her attention. At last he got away, awkwardly, and for many minutes the strange girl sat like a statue, her long lashes just veiling her eyes, so that Pinckney, from a distance, could not see what was in them. Suddenly the veil was drawn, and her eyes shone full upon him, her look meeting his. Pinckney's glance fell, and his cheeks grew redder. Miss Warfield's face did not change, but she rose and walked unattended through the center of the ballroom to the door. Pinckney's seat was nearer it than hers. She passed him as if without seeing him, moving with unconscious grace, though it would not have been the custom at that time for a girl to cross so large a room alone. Just then, someone asked Miss Austen for a dance, and Pinckney, who was growing weary of it, went out on the piazza for a cigar, and then, attracted by the beauty of the night, strayed further than he knew, alone along the cliffs above the sea. The next day he was walking with Miss Austen, and they passed her in her riding habit, waiting by the mounting stone. She bowed to Miss Austen alone, leaving him out, as it seemed to Pinckney, with exaggerated care. "Is she not beautiful?" said Emily ardently. Said Pinckney. A short time after, as they were driving on the road to the fort, he saw her again. She was riding alone across country, through the rocky knolls and marshy pools that form the southern part of Rhode Island. She had no groom lagging behind, but it was not so necessary then as now, and indeed a groom would have had a hard time to keep up with her, as she rattled up the granite slopes and down over logs and bushes with her bright bay horse. The last Pinckney saw of her, she disappeared over a rocky hill against the sky. Her beautiful horse flecked with foam, quivering with happy animal life, and the girl calm as a figure carved in stone, with but the faintest touch of rose upon her face, as the pure profile was outlined one moment against the sunlit blue. "How recklessly she rides," whispered Miss Austen to him, and Pinckney said yes, absently, and, whipping up his horse, drove on, pretending to listen to his fiancée's talk. It seemed to be about dresses and rings, and a coming visit to the Blanks at Nahant. He had never seen a girl like her before. She was a puzzle to him. "It is a great pity she is engaged to Mr. Breeze," said Miss Austen, and Pinckney woke up with a start, for he was thinking of Miss Warfield too. "Why?" said he. "I don't like him," said Emily. "He isn't good enough for her." As this is a thing that women say of all wooers after they have won, and which the winner is usually at that period the first to admit, Pinckney paid little attention to this remark. But that evening he met Miles Breeze, saw him, talked with him, and heard others talk of him. A handsome man physically, well-made, well-dressed, well-fed, well-bred as breeding goes in dogs or horses, a good shot, a good sportsman, yachtsman, storyteller, a good fellow with a weak mouth, a man of good old Maryland blood, yet red and healthy, who had come there in his yacht and had his horses sent by sea. A well-appointed man, in short, provided amply with the conveniences of fashionable life. A man of good family, good fortune, good health, good sense, good nature, whom it were hypocritical to charge with lack of soul. The first duty of a gentleman is to be a good animal, and Miles Breeze performed it thoroughly. Pinckney liked him, and he could have been his companion for years, and still have liked him, except as a husband for Miss Warfield. He could not but recognize his excellence as a party, but the race of Joan of Arc does not mate with Bonhomme Richard, even when he owns the next farm. Pinckney used to watch the crease of Breeze's neck above the collar, and curse. Coming upon Miss Austen one morning, she had said, "Come, I want to introduce you to Miss Warfield." Pinckney had demurred, and offered as an excuse that he was smoking. "Nonsense, Charles," said the girl. "I have told her you were coming." Pinckney threw away his cigar and followed, and the presentation was made. Miss Warfield drew herself almost unusually erect after curtsying, as if in protest at having to bow at all. She was so tall that as Emily stood between them, he could meet Miss Warfield's iron-grain eyes above her head. It was the first time in Pinckney's life that he had consciously not known what to say. "I was so anxious to have you meet Charles before he left," said Emily. Evidently, his fiancée had been expatiating upon him to this new friend, and if there is anything that puts a man in a foolish position, it is to have this sort of preamble precede an acquaintance. "An anxiety I duly shared, Miss Warfield, I assure you," said he, which was a truth spoiled in the uttering, what the conversational Frenchman terms banal. "Thank you," said Miss Warfield, very simply and tremendously effectively. Pinckney, for the second time with this young lady, felt himself a schoolboy. Emily interposed some feeble commonplaces, and then, after a moment, Miss Warfield said, "I must go for my ride," and she left with a smile for Emily and the faintest possible glance for him. She went off with Breeze, and it gave Pinckney some relief to see that she seemed equally to ignore the presence of the man who was her acknowledged lover, as he trotted on a smart cob beside her. That evening, when he went on the piazza after tea, he found her sitting alone in one corner with her hands folded. It was one peculiarity about this woman that she was never seen with work. She made no sign of recognition as he approached, but nonetheless he took the chair that was beside her and waited a moment for her to speak. "Have you found Miss Austen?" said the beauty, with the faintest trace of malice in her coldly modulated tones, not looking at him. "I am not looking for Miss Austen," said he, and she continued not looking at him, and so this strange pair sat there in the twilight, silent. What was said between them I do not know, but in some way or other their minds met, for long after Miss Austen and her mother had returned from some call, long after they had all left him, Pinckney continued to pace up and down restlessly in the dark. Pinckney had never seen a woman like this. After all, he was very young, and he had, in his heart, supposed that the doubts and delights of his soul were peculiar to men alone. He thought all women, at all events, all young and worthy women, regarded life and its accepted forms as an accomplished fact, not to be questioned, and indeed too delightful to need it. The young South Carolinian, in his ambitions, in his heart-longings and heart-sickenings, in his poetry, even in his emotions, had always been lonely, so that his loneliness had grown to seem to him as merely part of the day's work. The best women he knew were the best housewives. They were a rest and a benefit for the war-weary man, much as might be a pretty child, a bed of flowers, a strain of music. With Emily Austen he should find all this, and he loved her, as good, pretty, amiable, perfect in her way. But now, with Miss Warfield, it had seemed that he was not even lonely. Pinckney did not see her again for a week. When he met her, he avoided her. She certainly avoided him. Breeze, meantime, gave a dinner. He gave it on his yacht, and gave it to men alone. Pinckney was of the number. End of section 19. Section 20 of Short Story Classics, American, Volume 2, by Various. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Drew Rice. Short Story Classics, American, Volume 2, by Various. Our Consul at Carlsruhe, by F. J. Stimson. J.S. of Dale. Part 2. The next day there was a driving party. It was to drive out of town to Purgatory, a pretty place, where there is a brook in a deep ravine with a verdant meadow floor. And there they were to take food and drink, as is the way of humanity in pretty places. Now, it so happened that the Austens, Miss Warfield, Breeze, and Pinckney were going to drive in a party, the Austins and Miss Warfield having carriages of their own. But at the last moment Breeze did not appear, and Emily Austen was incapacitated by a headache. She insisted, as is the way of loving women, that Charles should not lose it, for to her it was one of life's pleasures, and such pleasures satisfied her soul. It may be that she gave more of her soul to life's duties than did Charles, and life's pleasures were thus adequate to the remainder. I do not know. Probably Miles Breeze also had a headache. At all events, he did not, at the last moment, appear. It was supposable that he would turn up at the picnic. Mrs. Austen joined her daughter's entreaty. Miss Warfield was left unattended. In fine, Pinckney went with her. Miss Warfield had a solid little phaeton with 2 stout ponies. She drove herself. For some time they were silent. Then, insensibly, Pinckney began to talk, and she to answer. What they said I need not say. Indeed, I could not, for Pinckney was a poet, a man of rare intellect and imagination, and Miss Warfield was a woman of this world and the next, a woman who used conventions as another might use a fan to screen her from fools whose views were based on the ultimate. But they talked of the world and of life in it, and when it came to an end, Pinckney noted to himself this strange thing, that they had both talked as of an intellectual problem, no longer concerning their emotions. In short, as if this life were at an end, and they were 2 dead people discussing it. So they arrived at the picnic, silent, and the people assembled looked to one another and smiled, and said to one another how glum those 2 engaged people looked, being together and each wanting another. Mr. Breeze had not yet come, and as the people scattered while the luncheon was being prepared, Pinckney and she wandered off like the others. They went some distance, perhaps a mile or more, aimlessly, and then, as they seemed to have come about to the end of the valley, Pinckney sat down upon a rock, but she did not do so, but remained standing. Hardly a word had so far been said between them, and then Pinckney looked at her and said, "Why are you going to marry Mr. Breeze?" "Why not?" listlessly. "You might as well throw yourself into the sea," said Pinckney, and he looked at the sea which lay beyond them shimmering. "That I had not thought of," said she, and she looked at the sea herself with more interest. Pinckney drew a long breath. "But why this man?" he said at length. "Why that man?" said the woman, and her beautiful lip curled with the humor of the mind, while her eyes kept still the sadness of the heart, the look that he had seen in the ballroom. "We are all poor," she added, then scornfully, "it is my duty to marry." "But Miles Breeze?" persisted Pinckney. The lip curled almost to a laugh. "I never met a better fellow than Miles," said she. And the thought was so like his own of the night before that Pinckney gasped for breath. They went back and had chicken croquettes and champagne, and a band that was hidden in the woods made some wild Spanish music. Going home, a curious thing happened. They had started first and far preceded all the others. Miss Warfield was driving, and when they were again in the main road, not more than a mile from the hotel, Pinckney saw ahead of them, coming in a light trotting buggy of the sort that one associates with the gentry who call themselves sports, 2 of the gentlemen whom he had met at Breeze's dinner the night before. Whether Miss Warfield also knew them he did not know, but they evidently had more wine than was good for them, and were driving along in a reckless manner on the wrong side of the road. The buggy was much too narrow for the 2, and the one that was driving leaned out toward them with a tipsy leer. Pinckney shouted at him, but Miss Warfield drove calmly on. He was on the point of grasping the reins, but a look of hers withheld him, and he sat still, wondering. And in a moment their small front wheel had crashed through both the axles and spiderweb wheels of the trotting buggy. The shock of the second axle whirled them round, and Pinckney fell violently against the dasher, while Miss Warfield was thrown clear of the phaeton on the outer side. But she had kept the reins, and before Pinckney could get to her, she was standing at her horses' heads, patting their necks calmly, with a slight cut in her forehead where she had fallen, and only her nostril quivering like theirs as the horses stood there trembling. The buggy was a wreck, and the horse had disappeared, and the two men, sobered by the fall, came up humbly to her to apologize. She heard them silently, with a pale face like some injured queen's, and then, bowing to them their dismissal, motioned Pinckney into the phaeton, which, though much broken, was still standing, and, getting in herself, drove slowly home. She might have killed herself, thought Pinckney, but he held his peace as if it were the most natural course of action in the world. To tell the truth, under the circumstances he might have done the same alone. Then it began. Pinckney could not keep this woman out of his head. He would think of her at all times, alone and in company. Her face would come to him in the loneliness of the sea, in the loneliness of crowds. The strong spirit of the morning was hers, and the sadness of the sunset, and the wakeful watches of the night. Her face was in the clouds of evening, in the sea-coal fire by night, her spirit in the dreams of summer morns, in the hopeless breakers on the stormy shores, in the useless, endless effort of the sea. Her eyes made some strange shining through his dreams, and he would wait with a cry that she was going from him, in the deepest hours of the night, as if in the dreams he had lost her, vanishing forever in the daily crowd. Then he would lie awake until morning, and all the laws of God and men would seem like cobwebs to his sorrow, and the power of it freezing in his heart. This was the ultimate nature of his being, to follow her, as drop of water blends in drop of water, as frost rends rock. Let him then follow out his law, as other beings do theirs. Gravitation has no conscience. Should he be weaker than a drop of water, because he was conscious, and a man? So these early morning battles would go on, and character, training, conscience would go down before the simpler force, like bands of mans upon essential nature. Then, with the first ray of the dawn, he would think of Emily Austen, sleeping near him, perhaps dreaming of him, and his mad visions seemed to fade, and he would rise exhausted and wander out among the fresh fields and green dewy lanes and calm, contentful trees, and be glad that these things were so. Yet could these not be moved, nor their destiny be changed? And as for him, what did it matter? So the days went by, and Emily Austen looked upon him with eyes of limitless love and trust, and Pinckney did not dare to look upon himself. But his mind judged by daytime, and his heart strove by night. Hardly at all had he spoken to Miss Warfield since, and no reference had ever been made between them to the accident, or to the talk between them in the valley. Only Pinckney knew that she was to be married very shortly, and he had urged Miss Austen to hasten their own wedding. Emily went off with her mother to pay her last visit among the family, and to make her preparations. And it was deemed proper that at this time Pinckney should not be with her. So he stayed in Newport 5 long days alone, and during this time he never spoke to Miss Warfield. I believe he tried not to look at her. She did not look at him, and on the 5th night Pinckney swore that he must speak to her once more, whatever happened. In the morning there was talk of a sailing party, and Pinckney noted Breeze busying himself about the arrangements. He waited, and at noon Breeze came to him and said that there was a scarcity of men. Would he go? Yes. They had 2 sailboats, and meant to land upon Connecticut, which was then a barren island without a house, upon the southern end where it stretches out to sea. Pinckney did not go in the same boat with Breeze and Miss Warfield, and, landing, he spent the afternoon with others, and saw nothing of her. But after dinner was over, he spoke to her, inviting her to walk, and she came, silently. A strange evening promenade that was. They took a path close on the sheer brink of the cliffs, so narrow that one must go behind the other. Pinckney had thought at first she might be frightened, with the rough path and the steepness of the rocks, and the breakers churning at their base. But he saw that she was walking erect and fearlessly. Finally, she motioned him to let her go ahead, and she led the way, choosing indiscriminately the straightest path, whether on the verge of the sea or leading through green meadows. A few colorless remarks were made by him, and then he saw the folly of it, and they walked in silence. After nearly an hour, she stopped. "We must be getting back," she said. "Yes," said he, in the same tone, and they turned, she still leading the way while he followed silently. They were walking toward the sunset. The sun was going down in a bank of dense gray cloud, but its long level rays came over to them, across a silent sea. She walked on over the rugged cliff, like some siren, some genius of the place, with a sure, proud grace of step. She never looked around, and his eyes were fixed upon the black line of her figure as it went before him toward the gray and blood-red sunset. It seemed to him this was the last hour of his life, and even as he thought, his ankle turned and he stumbled and fell, walking unwittingly into one of the chasms where the line of the cliff turned in. He grasped a knuckle of rock and held his fall, just on the brink of a ledge above the sea. Miss Warfield had turned quickly and seen it all, and she leaned down over the brink, with one hand around the rock and the other extended to help him, the ledge on which he lay being some 6 feet below. Pinckney grasped her hand and kissed it. Her color did not change at this, but with a strange strength in her beautiful lithe figure, she drew him up steadily, he helping partly with the other hand, until his knees rested on the path again. He stood up with some difficulty, as his ankle was badly wrenched. "I'm afraid you cannot walk," said she. "Oh, yes," he answered, and took a few steps to show her. The pain was great, but she walked on, and he followed as best he could, limping. She looked behind now as if to encourage him, and he set his teeth and smiled. "We must not be late," she said. "It is growing dark, and they will miss us." But they did not miss them, for when they got to the landing place, both the sailboats had left the shore without them. There was nothing but the purple cloud-light left by this time, but Pinckney fancied he could see her face grow pale for the first time that day. "We must get home," she said hurriedly. "Is there no boat?" Pinckney pointed to a small dory on the beach, and then to the sea. In the east was a black bank of cloud, rifted now and then by lightning, and from it the wind came down, and the white caps curled angrily toward them. "No matter," said she. "We must go." Pinckney found a pair of oars under the boat, and dragged it, with much labor, over the pebbles, she helping him. The beach was steep and gravelly, with short breakers rather than surf, and he got the bow well into the water and held it there. "Get in," said he. Miss Warfield got into the stern, and Pinckney waded out, dragging the flat-bottomed boat until it was well afloat. Then he sprang in himself, and, grasping the oars, headed the boat for the Fort Point across the channel, 3 miles away. She sat silently in the stern, and it was too dark for him to see her face. He rowed savagely, but the wind was straight ahead, and the sea increasing every moment. They were not, of course, exposed to the full swell of the ocean, but the wide sea channel was full of short, fierce waves that struck the little skiff, repeated rapid blows, and dashed the spray over both of them. "Are you not afraid?" said he calmly. "It is growing rougher every minute." "Oh, no, Mr. Pinckney," said she. "Pray keep on." Pinckney noticed a tremor of excitement in her voice, but by a flash of lightning that came just then, he saw her deep eyes fixed on his, and the pure white outline of her face undisturbed. So he rowed the harder, and she took a board there was and tried to steer, and now and then as the clouds were lit, he saw her like a fleeting vision in the night. But the storm grew stronger, and Pinckney knew the boat that they were in was not really moving at all, though, of course, the swash of the waves went by and the drifted spray. He tried to row harder, but with the pain in his ankle and the labor, he was nearly exhausted, and his heart jumped in his chest at each recover. "Can you not make it?" said she in the dark, and Pinckney vowed that he could, and set his teeth for a mighty pull. The oar broke, and the boat's head fell rapidly off in the trough of the sea. He quickly changed about his remaining oar, and with it kept the head to the wind. "We must go back," he said, panting. "I know," said she. The windstorm was fairly upon them, and in spite of all his efforts, an occasional wave would get upon the beam and spill its frothing crest into the boat. Pinckney almost doubted whether it would float until it reached the shore, but Miss Warfield did not seem in the least disturbed, and spoke without a tremor in her voice. The lightning had stopped now, and he could not see her. He had miscalculated the force of the wind and waves, however, for in a very few minutes they were driven broadside back upon the beach, almost at the same place from which they had started. Miss Warfield sprang out quickly, and he after, just as the wave turned the dory bottom upward on the stones. "They will soon send for us," he said, and stepping painfully up the shore, he occupied himself with spreading her shawl in a sheltered spot for them to wade in. She sat down, and he beside her. He was very wet, and she made him put some of the shawl over himself. The quick summer storm had passed now, with only a few big drops of rain, and the moon was breaking out fitfully through veils of driving clouds and their storm scud. By its light he looked at her, and their eyes met. Pinckney groaned aloud and stood up. "Would that they would never come! Would God that we could—" "We cannot," said she, softly in a voice that he had never heard from her before, a voice with tears in it. And the man threw himself down at her feet, inarticulate, maddened. Then, with a great effort at control, not touching her, but looking straight into her eyes, he said, in blunt, low speech, "Miss Warfield, I love you. Do you know it?" Her head sank slowly down, but she answered, very low but clearly, yes. Then their eyes met again, and, by some common impulse, they rose and walked apart. After a few steps, he stopped, being lame, and leaned against the cliff. But she went on until her dark figure was blended with the shadows of the crags. So, when the boat came back, its sail silvered by the moonlight, they saw it, and, coming down, they met again. But only as the party were landing on the beach. Several of the party had come back, and Mr. Breeze, who was among them, was full of explanation how he had missed the first boat and barely caught the second, supposing that his fiancée was in the first. An awkward accident, but easily explained by Pinckney with the sprain in his ankle, and indeed the others were too full of excuses for having forgotten them to inquire into the causes of their absence together. Pinckney went to his room and had a night of delirium. Toward morning, his troubled wakefulness ended, and he fell into a dream. He dreamed that in the center of the world was one green bower beneath a blossoming tree, and he and Miss Warfield were there, and the outer world was being destroyed, one sphere by fire and the other by flood, and there was only this bower left. But they could not stay there, or the tree would die. So they went away, he to the one side and she to the other, and the ruins of the world fell upon them, and they saw each other no more. In the morning his delirium left him, and his will resumed its sway. He went down and out into the green roads, and listened to the singing of the birds, and then out to the cliff path, and there he found Miss Warfield, sitting as if she knew that he would come. He watched her pure face while she spoke, and her gray eyes, the clear light of the morning was in them, and on the gleaming sea beyond. "You must go," said she. "Yes," he said. And that was all. He took her hand for one moment and lifted it lightly to his lips. Then he turned and took the path across the fields. When he got to the first stile, he looked around. She was still sitting there, turned toward him. He lifted his hat and held it for a second or two. Then he turned the corner of the hedge and went down to the town. Thus it happened that this story, which began sadly with an epitaph, may end with wedding bells. Married at King's Chapel by the Reverend Dr. A. Blank, the 21st of September, Charles Austin Pinckney to Emily, daughter of the late James Austin. End of Section 20. End of Short Story Classics, American, Volume 2, by Various.